Hello, everyone. It's nice to have you all gathered here, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to say hello and welcome you to this 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks and what it means to me and what we've been working on and where we are today. As many of you may know, we have been working for a very long time to hold the perpetrators accountable for the horrible attack on our country that led to the death of my husband and nearly 3,000 others on American soil. It's been a very difficult road that we've been on, a very difficult path to find the truth about who was behind the attacks, how they were facilitated, and why did they attack us? We don't have all those answers yet. We've been asking those, and some of those questions, some of the answers to those questions lie within our own government. They did a nearly 10-year investigation into the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for the role that they played in facilitating the attacks, and it was a secret investigation. Nobody was supposed to know about it until an investigative reporter in Florida uncovered a 2012 FBI report, and although it was heavily redacted at the time, you could read between the lines that there was a lot of information there. And we served a subpoena on the kingdom over 3 years ago, and they did not comply. They did not hand over all the documents that were asked for. They overly classified many more documents, and they rubber stamped state secrets on several more. This is a very egregious act towards the families and towards the American people. We all deserve to know the truth. We all deserve to know why this happened to us. Well, it's just so nice for us to all be together again at such a difficult time of year and show the kind of support that these concerts have always done in the past, and uplift our hearts and open our hearts again to the beauty in the world. With everything we've been through, COVID, and approaching this 20th anniversary, it's more important than ever that we band together and share, a unified feeling of hope, that, the world will be a better place if we just all band together.
Hello, and we want to welcome you all to today's commemoration, day of reflection, day of self-recognition also. 20 years ago at 9 a.m. on September 11th, Lyndon LaRouche, economist, statesman, and co-founder of the Schiller Institute, found himself involved in an unexpected but very important role in the unfolding events of 9/11. Here to describe it is Jack Stockwell.
Good day. My name is Jack Stockwell. Lynn was a friend of mine. At 9 o'clock in the morning of September 11th, Lynn was on my live radio show with me in Salt Lake City, Utah. I don't even remember what we were going to talk about that morning, but only a few minutes into the show and the attack on America was underway. And Lynn immediately said, without any apparent forethought or trying to figure things out, they will blame this on Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And this is simply not possible to be done from a cave in Afghanistan. This is only possible through the complicity of corrupt and criminal elements of the United States security apparatus. So, of course, it was immediately branded a conspiracy theory. And by the way, any of you listening, if you have any extra conspiracy theories, I need some, because all mine have come true. But if you ask the average person on the street what happened on 9/11, they're going to tell you the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, and maybe the annual reading of the names of those that perished, and of some jokester, possible congressional candidates coming along saying, if you elect me, I'll make sure the government tells you all the truth there is about 9/11. Just like we're all waiting for the truth on JFK or UFOs. But what the average adult alive back then does not remember, and I was reading an essay the other day by Thierry Masson, and was that same morning after, the smoke is billowing down the streets and everybody's panicking and running around, 10 o'clock that morning, Richard Clark triggered the continuity of government plan. Bush was rushed off to Nebraska with the top CEOs of the top floor corporations of the Twin Towers the night before. And the members of high office, other members of high office, I think maybe Cheney, were ushered off to that mountain in West Virginia, supposedly waiting for the destruction, as that last plane was supposed to do, of the Capitol building to bring an end of our constitutional republic. So a month and a half, and this is where it gets into more of Lynn's predictions. A month and a half after the attacks, the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, created the Office of Forced Transformation. And from then on, the United States was no longer going to win any wars. In fact, they were going to drag wars out just as long as they possibly could. And this is exactly what has just happened in Afghanistan. The war started there right after 9/11, was only supposed to last for a few weeks, but it never stopped. And none of the conflicts that began in these same Middle Eastern countries that began after 9/11 have ended. On the contrary, just complete instability has taken hold in Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, and all of Lynn's predictions have been verified over the last 20 years. And it's troubling that very few people can actually see how much the world has changed, all in the footprint that he predicted back then. Most refuse to see the responsibility of the Western democracies for the crimes committed in the wider Middle East. And day by day, these same people cannot see what has happened, as Lynn also predicted, the tremendous level of surveillance, the surveillance of every one of us to the point now where most of us are in denial to the level that we are being watched, monitored, recorded, lists that we're being put on, even to the point where Australia is now probably the most dangerous country on the planet for human rights. And in this country, politics have completely taken over science with the mandatory this and the mandatory that. I wondered, as I was preparing for this, I wondered what Lynn would have to predict for the next 20 years, since he was so accurate about the last 20 years. But there's really nothing to wonder. If you understand Lynn's worldview, Helga's, Harley's, and all the rest of the associates, then if you understand the American principle that Lynn taught, if you can see past the evening news readers on television, the only way out of this current situation is Lynn's concept of an economic unity among sovereign nations versus empire. What a prophetic declaration that early morning on my radio show, 9/11/01. And if Lynn was so correct about his on-the-spot, off the top of his head analysis of what happened that morning and what would happen as a result following that morning, what else might he have been correct about? Thank you for this honor.
Well, I'm still sitting here looking at this incredible picture, this incredible image in front of me of this burning World Trade Center as these two jets have just slammed. One jet has slammed into each of the two towers. So we'll go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and get my guest on here with me. Mr. LaRouche.
Yes.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Jack.
Well, what a pleasure and an honor to have you back on my program again. I was hoping to move the discussion initially with what we were going to do here into the area of the sublime.
Yes, right.
But now with what has just happened in New York with this, which, it's interesting enough, just yesterday I received, I think it was just yesterday, a bundle of leaflets from your organization in Leesburg that I regularly pass out of my office, warning of terrorist attacks in America here very shortly.
Yeah.
And here we have, the morning that you're on my program, what's happening in New York at the World Trade Center. I don't know if you've seen these images or pictures yet on the television.
I haven't yet. I was just sitting up here working and just heard about it before I went and called you.
Yeah, well, the smoke is billowing out of the one tower here. My wife called me a moment ago, and apparently they caught live on film the second jet smashing into one of the other towers.
So obviously this is not exactly an accident.
No. No, sir, I don't believe it is.
It's not a coincidence. It's obviously, this is so remote a probability that there has to be intention in this thing.
Well, it's one thing for somebody to strap on a jacket made of dynamite and walk into a diner in downtown Jerusalem. It's another thing to jump inside of a Learjet and go smashing in the side of a building like
The thing you have to look at in the context in which this is occurring is two things. Now, first of all, the first suspicion that's going to be on this is Osama bin Laden. That name is going to come up prominently, whether as suspicion or just suspicion.
Certainly.
And the second thing, which is not unrelated to the Osama bin Laden question, is this festival, which is planned, really a terrorist festival for Washington, D.C.
At the end of the month.
Yep. We have a global process. The financial system's coming down. That's always a dangerous thing. Because when the entire system is in being shaken up the way it is now by the financial collapse, political things happen. Because various people try to intervene and orchestrate events by spectacular interventions, which will change, shall we say, get public attention off one thing and put it on another. So this is obvious. I cannot draw a conclusion except the circumstances tell me something rather evil is behind this thing. And I don't know which, but they're both connected. Because I know the Goldsmith brothers, for example, Jimmy Goldsmith was key in helping to create, he's now deceased, Osama bin Laden and people like that, the Taliban and so forth. And at the same time, his brother, Eddie Goldsmith, who is still very much alive, is sort of the spiritual godfather of this movement, which is planning to inundate Washington, D.C. with some pretty nasty stuff at the end of this month.
The FBI is now saying that a plane was possibly hijacked for this attack. If you can do that with the World Trade Center, what could you do with the White House?
Absolutely. I've been very concerned about this. I'm not very sympathetic with what some of these agencies do. But I'm concerned not just as a presidential free candidate, but I'm concerned with the security of the United States and the peace of the world. And this is not good for the health of the nation or the world. These things should not happen. We could prevent this kind of stuff, but we just don't do it because someone says let it happen.
How would you prevent terrorist activity?
Well, the thing is, if you dispense with the myth that there are a number of unknown people up there coming out of the myths and nobody knows where they come from, then you would say, how can you stop the terrorist operations? If you know how the world is actually organized, you know you cannot organize a sustained preparation for terrorist operations in any country without the backing of a powerful government or governments. So that if you know what the operation is, and I would say, I've been warning against this Teddy Goldsmith operation all along because I know what it's connected to politically. It's extremely dangerous. And if I had been president or in a similar position during this period, I would have had an all-out, very discreet, but very all-out and effective discussion with some other governments in the world, and we together would have taken appropriate steps to try to neutralize this kind of danger. Of course, you can't be 100% in this sort of thing, but you can do a pretty good job. And 2 planes, now that's pretty big. That's one plane that might not be preventable. But 2 in the same shot, no, that's not small time stuff.
Lynn, you were saying there a moment ago that the system was over. Now, what a lot of my listeners need to understand, Mr. LaRouche, is the difference between our economic systems of this country that's driving this market crash and basic economics. But there's a difference you can go in right now and change the economics to save the system, rather than leaving the same system of economics that's currently afloat and watching it crash on the shores of absolute bankruptcy. There are things that can be done right now to save our system and leave it intact, or not the system, but the economy of this country, with a drastic change in the system.
Very simply, you just use the principle of general welfare, which is as it's actually intended in the preamble of the Constitution. As Roosevelt used that authority, you declare bankruptcy when needed. For example, most of the banks in the United States are potentially bankrupt if they're not already bankrupt. Well, do you let the banks shut down? If you don't, you have the Treasury Department move in on the Federal Reserve System, which is the mother of these things, take over the Federal Reserve System under bankruptcy reorganization, and under the authority of bankruptcy reorganization in cooperation with the states, who also control banks. You make sure that banks that must keep their doors open will keep their doors open. You must ensure that employment is maintained. You must ensure that actually it grows. You must ensure that pensions are paid. You must ensure that communities function. And you must also have some growth. Otherwise, how are you going to reorganize out of bankruptcy if you don't have some real growth? Which means that certain projects, like infrastructure projects, necessary ones, are put into place to absorb some of the unemployment, which is inevitable, and get the economy moving again. On that basis, using nothing but the precedents we have in our national law, national history, we could reorganize this economy out of a virtually total monetary and financial collapse by the will of government and the cooperation of the people, with good leadership in a very short period of time.
We got a minute left. Can you bring something sublime out of this?
Yeah, I think the point is, when you get a crisis, which is like a war. I mean, this what is reported in New York, you're talking about 50,000 people possibly killed. Do you realize that's in the order of magnitude of the official death toll?
Of Vietnam.
Vietnam?
Yes.
So this is not a minor thing. This is not something that happened. This is not a terrorist incident. This is something much bigger. But when you get into a crisis like this, the first thing you have to do, especially terrible crises, the more terrible they are, the more this principle applies. Do not panic. Do not shout fire in a crowded theater. Get the people safely out. And what's needed now is to recognize that we got to this mess because the institutions of our government, forget who did it, forget who did whatever's done. But think about this could not have happened if our government functioned. And the reason our government didn't function and doesn't function, I hope that changes quickly now, is because nobody was paying attention.
Yes.
Therefore, let us pay attention and recognize that when we were running the economy the way we were running it, the things we've been doing, we have set ourselves up for this kind of crisis. The thing to respond to a crisis like this is to remove long-term and medium-term causes of the crisis itself, of the situation which allowed this to happen and come to this pass.
Lyndon, we've got to go.
Good.
Thank you so much, sir, for being my guest today.
Thank you, Zach.
We'll talk to you again.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
You just heard the prescient words of Lyndon LaRouche as the events of September 11th, 2001 were unfolding. Lynn devoted the rest of his life to do what he said at the end of that discussion, to bring to light what was behind this and how to change it, what measures could be taken to prevent a continuing economic collapse and a continued confrontational situation between the United States and other nations. With him, that whole fight to the end of his life and then continuing after that is our next speaker, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Helga?
Hello. I greet all of you. Well, it is quite interesting that this interview, which Jack Stockwell, and I say hello to you, also very friendly and heartily, is obviously so much on the mind of relevant circuits that the largest French radio station, France Info, felt it necessary this morning to pick up on this statement saying that Lyndon LaRouche practically invented the conspiracy school surrounding 9/11, which is. I mean, they are so afraid that the truth may come out that they still feel obliged to slender Lynn in this way. Now, I mean, look at what is the result of this. I mean, I remember 9/11 very, very vividly, like practically all people who, either were in the United States or watched TV at the time. And, following this incredible event, the next days and actually weeks, the US population was hyped into a frenzy by the media playing these attacks into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon over and over, almost like a brainwashing, so that people running around with yellow ribbons, they had flags, American flags in their garden to show their patriotism. And this was a situation where, the Afghanistan war was prepared, and after 3 weeks, the war against Afghanistan was declared based on Article 5 of NATO. It was the defense case, so all the allies had to come to the defense and participate in the campaign in Afghanistan. And if you now review what happened since 9/11 and 20 years of war in Afghanistan, if you look at the totality of this process, it is without any question the largest disaster. It has caused an incredible amount of damage, both human lives and material losses. It cost altogether, all these wars which followed cost over $8 trillion, $8 trillion, which are not invested in infrastructure, schools, factories, and so forth. It cost more than 1 million people's life. It contributed to almost 70 million people becoming refugees. And, the end result of it is an unmitigated disaster of the largest military power on earth, the United States, in combination with NATO, demonstrating that they were unable to defeat 65,000 Taliban fighters. Now, that is not just an event. This has incredible strategic implications. And since power is not just a question of military strength, but also of perception, I think this is a very serious point and very urgently requires to reflect. Now, there are two ways of responding to this. One would be, to continue and escalate the revenge against the Taliban, the revenge against, everybody who could be possibly allied with them. And, Biden, on the one side, he said he would end the endless wars, and this would be the end of an era of endless wars, which was a very promising statement. But I think that the habit of 20 years of, war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, other countries around the world has done something with the public discourse. So when the suicide attack at the Kabul airport happened, which killed around 200 people, among them 13 American troops, Biden said, to those who carried out this attack, I tell you, we will not forgive, we will not forget, we will hunt you down and make you pay. Now, that is a language which unfortunately reminds one of what was said by Madame Albright. I mean, I'm not equating now what Biden said, but I'm just referring to the the tone. But what Madeleine Albright said in '96 in a program with 60 Minutes with Leslie Stahl, when she was asked, about the 500,000 children who had been killed in the Iraq War in the 90s, she said, well, that was worth the price. And then you all remember when Hillary Clinton was briefed about the killing, very brutal killing of Gaddafi, she said, we came, we saw, he died. And, this is something, which we have to reflect about, because this is barbarism. And we should all remember that if one, and this is the other way to go, which would be to really analyze what went wrong and what method of politics contributed to this defeat and this disaster. Well, I think one would not get around to start with, or at least one of the major elements would be the role of Zbigniew Brzezinski. Because the escalation of that kind of international terrorism as it developed in the last 40 years definitely had to do with Brzezinski's bright idea to play the Islamic card against the Soviet Union. This was a proposal which he made in 1975 already at a meeting of the Trilateral Commission in Tokyo, where he proposed to arm and train Islamists for the fight against the Soviet Union. And that was being done. And then after the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 by the Soviets, they played a very important role in the fight for 10 years. And the Soviets could not win that fight either. And that lost fight for the Soviets contributed to the demise of the Soviet Union at large. But when the Soviet Union disintegrated, these mujahideen did not just dissolve. They had been trained, they had been equipped with modern weapons, with a lot of money. So they dispersed to Pakistan, to the former republics of the Soviet Union, Chechnya. They went into China, Xinjiang, and a lot of terrorism, a lot of what is being accused now, what China supposedly did against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, really has its origin there, that this was being promoted actually by the United States, by the British. So these forces then, basically organized secret units, assassination teams, and paramilitary squads for operations around the world. And they boosted the opium trade and the heroin, opium production and heroin trade. And so that is what, contributed to the mess in this region. Now, the Afghanistan war is finished, hopefully forever. But what is the situation? The UN Special Report for Afghanistan, the U.S. Development Program put out a 17-page report about the absolutely horrendous situation in Afghanistan now, which are escalated by the financial warfare going on by the transatlantic institutions. This report says that there are presently 10 million Afghanistan children who need urgent humanitarian assistance to survive. 1 million suffer from acute malnutrition. And just think about the report which was made about the children in Yemen suffering malnutrition, which was published by Beasley and the World Food Program. And you can imagine how these Afghanistan children look like. Over 4 million are out of school. Of the entire population, there are 72% living below the poverty line. And with the financial warfare, there is the danger that another 25% of the people will fall below the poverty line, which would mean near universal poverty, extreme poverty, meaning that 97% of the Afghanistan population are below poverty. 18 million of them are food insecure. 4 million are in danger of dying of hunger in the coming winter. Now, in light of all of that, the fact that the Federal Reserve is withholding $9 billion, which actually belong to the Afghanistan people, on the grounds, that they don't recognize the Taliban government, then the IMF is withholding access to 450 million special drawing rights. The World Bank has stopped all financial reports. So, so the UN Special Representative for Afghanistan, Deborah Lyons, she briefed the UN Security Council on the 9th of September, and she said, if the sanctions against Afghanistan are not lifted immediately, there is the danger of a severe economic breakdown. Many more millions will completely fall into severe poverty and hunger, and Afghanistan will be thrown back by generations. Now, think about all this talk that these 20 years of, being there, helping women to have access to education, to work. Well, if they say that Afghanistan will be thrown back by generations, you can imagine what that will mean. And the Deborah Lyons warns that this would cause waves and waves of more refugees. Now, because of all of this, the currency already has plummeted. Therefore, the prices for food, fuel, medicine, and so forth have skyrocketed. The private banks are completely out of cash. Therefore, they cannot even distribute money to people who have small assets in the banks. And therefore, there is a complete inability to import any food, medicine, fuel, electricity, and other needed goods. So one of the most urgent things is we have to absolutely appeal to the Federal Reserve and to the Biden administration to release these $9 billion, to unfreeze any other assets and humanitarian aids and other monies which are withheld, to avoid a total breakdown and a collapse of the social order. Also, as Ms. Lyons is demanding, one has to give the Taliban the chance to demonstrate that they have really changed, and they have made a whole variety of promises, which they must have the chance to prove. Now, this is all extremely urgent because by the hour we are talking here, children are dying and the country is in utmost danger. They have a gigantic humanitarian crisis. So there will be, in 2 days from today, in Geneva, a conference on Afghanistan organized by the United Nations. And shortly thereafter, there will be another conference by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Dushanbe. And obviously, immediate aid and development programs must be put there. Now, I think that the more fundamental question, there must be an immediate aid program for Afghanistan. There is an absolute need. If we fail to do that as a human species, then we don't have the moral fitness to survive in general. This is a test case for our ability to live as human beings. But the more fundamental question is that, obviously the whole policy, which was the basis for the Afghanistan war, quite independently of 9/11, for Iraq, the Iraq wars, the attack against the Syrian government, the total destruction of Libya, and many other such so-called humanitarian intervention wars, that has to stop. There has to be a completely different policy, and one has to reflect on the fact, the sleep of reason gives birth to monsters, and that sleep of reason was already around 9/11. But if you think that the Afghanistan war, in one sense, that was one thing related to 9/11, even so the circumstances were such that they need to come to the surface, as my husband said already on the moment it happened. But the wars which came after that, I mean, the war against Iraq and Saddam Hussein did not even have a shred of evidence. I mean, first of all, it was known to anybody who knows the region even somewhat that Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda were enemies. He put many of these people in jail, and then to claim that he had instigated or participated in 9/11 was a lie which was known to everybody. Nancy Pelosi, in her eternal wisdom, was so kind to reveal this about a year ago in an answer to a question of a student, where she said basically, that she, in her capacity of the intelligence committee, some intelligence committee in the Senate, that she knew, like everybody else, that there were no weapons of mass destructions. And it is also known that Colin Powell knew that before he gave his infamous speech to the United Nations. Tony Blair, who has instigated all of these policies and who is still hyping such war to continue, these people must at some point be hold accountable for the consequences of what they did. But that is for some other time. What is right now important is that we really change the approach. If you have a cycle of violence, if you have I kill you because you killed my brother, and then, this goes on among nations forever, there is no good end. War is not a means of conflict resolution. And latest, in the presence of thermonuclear weapons, this should be clear that if we continue this game, we will lead to our own self-destruction. What many experts fear, that if the withdrawal of Afghanistan only means to redirect forces to have more elbow room for the confrontation with Russia and China, leading to conflict and confrontation over Taiwan, Ukraine, this can only lead to a catastrophe. We absolutely, fundamentally must change our ways. And there is a very guaranteed and very proven, effective and human way of dealing with conflicts. I want to cite at this point the role of Mahatma Gandhi, who defeated the British Empire with the method of nonviolence, and who also was instrumental in developing what was later known to become the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, the famous Panchayil, what also went into the non-aligned conference, the Bandung conference, and which was one of the key philosophical elements which went into the United Nations Charter and international law as we know it. And this is what we absolutely have to return to. We cannot have a world ruled by the rules of a few who then enforce these rules with the methods we have seen in the last 20 years. This method has failed, and it absolutely must be replaced by diplomacy, by negotiation, by a dialogue, and all conflicts must be resolved through such methods of diplomacy and dialogue. And the question of nonviolence. I think one of the biggest heroes of American history, Martin Luther King, who was by far not just a civil rights leader, but he was one of the people who should have been president. And he developed this idea that you have to find a way of reconciling and finding unity even among complete adversaries by addressing pressing problems and finding solutions to that. And that is exactly what we have tried in the recent period, especially after the assassination of George Floyd, in the creation of the Committee of Coincidence of Opposites, which is the idea that among conflicting groups, you have to find the higher idea, that which unites them, which gives them a mission to solve crucial problems together. And emphatically, this was meant around the pandemic, that we need to have a world health system, modern health system in every single country, because the pandemic will not vanish until every country has a modern hospital system, modern educated doctors and nurses, and vaccination for everybody. And, therefore, this is the immediate purpose of this committee of coincidence, to fight for such a world health system. But that approach, that is an approach which comes from Nikolaus of Cusa, a thinker of the 15th century from Germany, who had this idea that there is a higher one, which has a higher magnitude than the many. And that if the mind elevates itself to that level of reason, that higher level of creativity, you can find solutions to all problems which have arisen on the lower levels of conflict. And that principle has to be applied also for the relations among nations. With other words, there is not one nation which has the right to be better or think they are better than other nations. There is not the idea that, an unipolar world can function, but there has to be a cooperation among equals. There has to be a respect for the sovereignty of the other. But all of this is only possible if you think the one humanity first, the common aims of mankind, those problems which affect us all have to be, what unites us in terms of finding the solution. And then national interests find their place in a sort of subordinated way, and no nation can ever have an interest which goes against the interest of humanity as a whole.